So Double Exposure is a collaboration between students in the media school who have taken Suzanne Schwib's class to produce short films, and then composers in Jacobs. And the idea is that the students making the films will discuss with the composers what they're looking for in terms of music, and the composers will create scores for chamber ensembles to be played live to the screening in the IU Cinema. And my role in all of this is to serve as a sort of liaison for the composers and for the performers who are going to be playing the scores. That the Student Composer Association has been involved in recruiting the performers and keeping the composers in contact with the filmmakers and in contact with Professor Gupre to make sure they're aware of how the whole process is going to go, and that they have guidance as for what their role will look like in the process. I know that in the past it had been a smaller collaboration between a few student films from the media school, and then composers here working with John Gibson to write the scores for that. But in recent years, Larry Guppe's arrival has, let this flourish, as the students now have support from him in a visual media scoring perspective. And that's been really valuable to have. And then the program this year blossomed in an unexpected way of having 13 films, which was new, and then actually having 13 composers interested in scoring the films. So I'm optimistic that it'll be growing even further in the future. So at the beginning of the semester, the composers and the filmmakers meet at what we've called the speed dating event, in which each filmmaker will get to pitch to the composers what their idea is for a film. And similarly, the composers will get to demonstrate to the filmmakers what their compositional aesthetic is, or their tendencies as a composer. And then they rank who they would like to work with, and Professor Groupe and Suzanne Schwib and I discuss who we think would be best paired together. And then the filmmakers work on their films separately, and once those films are close to completion, the composers will start to sketch the emotional content of the music to get a feel for what the piece might include, but without necessarily locking into the timing of that. And then later, once they receive a final locked cut from the filmmakers, they get to go through and time out how exactly each section fits with the film. And then the conductors then have a challenge to take that and fit it to picture, which I admire them working to do that, and it's always incredible to see that rehearsal process come together. But once the scores are done, then the process is really heavily dependent on the conductors and then the student audio engineers who are working to create a mix such that the mic'd instruments in the cinema can be at the proper levels with all of the sound effects, with any dialogue. And so having the student audio engineers on that has been really valuable. Yeah, so in the recording session, that's when a lot of the details for how levels will come out are established. And I think, as I've observed it, the conductors seem to be more focused on the balance of the sound of the ensemble from an acoustic perspective, and then the audio engineers and the composer and Professor Goupet end up discussing, okay, how is this exactly going to fit the levels that we're looking for the film, and especially in relation to the effects or dialogue. The musical side of it is actually a really fast process. The composers will typically get to see very rough drafts in November or so. So that's when they can begin sketching the musical content, but can't necessarily guarantee how long any of those sections are going to be or really set it in stone until January. And in January, the composers receive the locked cuts from the filmmakers and have until only mid-February to finish that. So it's really, once it comes down to it, they only really have a month to finalize that score. And then the conductors have had it depends on exactly how we set up the deadlines, but typically in order to fit everything in, the conductors have about a week and the musicians have around, 3 or 4 days to practice their parts before the first rehearsal. So it's intense, and the rehearsals are long, and we're now that we got 13 films this year, hoping to reconsider the rehearsal process a little bit so it's not quite as tedious. But even with a reconsideration, it's still an intense process at the end. When we've had several guest composition speakers over the past year or so who have been visual media scorers, either for film or games or what have you. And one thing that's been really interesting about hearing their presentations is to get an idea for the intensity of the environment when it comes to how quickly, a media composer will need to produce their score. In a scenario like these composers have presented to us, they're not going to get an entire month. That's a luxury for us as students to have that. They might have a couple days to put together, or maybe the director will scrap that and they have one night to put together the score for a recording session the next day. And so I think having this process, which is a little more intense than I think we generally compose as students, especially when in our lessons many of us are focused on, crafting details over time with a long series of lessons to produce, the best possible piece we can at that point in time. And with a film score like this, you definitely still want to produce the best possible piece you can, but you need to think differently about how you're writing it for the different time scale. And then I'm sure the recording sessions, I can't compare those to what an industry recording session would be, but my impression is that the intensity and fast pace of these ones here for double exposure would be a foreshadowing of what it might be like. Yes, Suzanne Schwibs from the media school had mentioned once that the idea behind this was for the students to be able to create art films. And so if you're creating art films, then the hope would be that the music that goes with that is also in the same vein, and that you have the time and the freedom to feel like you can be more experimental, and you could try things that you wouldn't necessarily if you had gotten, say, like a scoring internship over the summer for a some of my friends for like a game music company or something. You're not going to have that same kind of freedom to try out what sounds and what musical content might work to picture. And you're not going to necessarily, if you had a really, really short amount of time, like one might in the industry, you're not going to have the same chance as students to go back and forth and have the filmmakers discuss with the composers what they're really looking for. One of the filmmakers this year ended up telling the composer for their film that what the composer had written really wasn't what they were going for. And so that composer restarted, and it still worked out, and I think it made it even better than it would have been otherwise. But it's still a short amount of time when we have a month, but to have that entire month for some of that back and forth, I think is a unique opportunity. Mark Hood guided all of the audio students in creating the recording and in creating the mixes and levels for the cinema screening. And when we were in the recording studio, would often be giving helpful advice to the students of exactly how they might want to produce the effect desired by the composer or that Larry Groupé brought up. So it's been really amazing to watch that interaction between the composer, the audio students, Mark Hood, and Professor Groupé happen. Mark Hood and Suzanne Schwipps and Larry Groupé and I are going to be meeting within the next few weeks to discuss this. One of the interesting things I think has been to consider maybe is whether or not films and scores are art films, or if they're in a different, more mainstream vein, and what that means for the composers and how they approach their work, or if what we're aiming to do is create a platform in which the film students and the composers can create whatever they're envisioning regardless of the genre, and that would be my hope for it. Another interesting thing to consider is that the instrumentation has traditionally always been a violin, a cello, a flute, a clarinet, and percussion, and harp. And there's only so much you can do with that. So although it may be logistically a lot more of a complex process to include different instrumentations for different films, I think that would be something that would be interesting to consider at some point.